She traveled 5,000 miles for a promise, and all she got was a man's disgust. 56-year-old Lahi Jun stepped off the train in Cheyenne, Wyoming, with nothing but a worn carpet bag and a letter that was supposed to be her ticket to a new life. The letter promised marriage to a widowed rancher named Wade Harlan. It promised a home. It promised a future. But promises, she was about to learn, could turn to dust as quickly as the red dirt swirling around her boots. Wade Harlan was waiting, just like the letter said. Medium height, hands calloused from work, eyes that sized her up like she was a horse at auction. He didn't even say hello. He just looked at her small 5-foot frame, and a sneer curled his lip. "You're smaller than I expected," he said, and the words were like a slap. "I specifically requested a sturdy woman, someone who can handle ranch work, not snap in half the first time a bull looks at her sideways." Lahi tried to speak. She tried to tell him that strength wasn't just about size, that her hands, though delicate, had 30 years of skill in them from her life as a seamstress, that her spirit had weathered storms he couldn't possibly imagine. But he wasn't listening. He'd already decided. "This won't do," he said, tipping his hat with a cold final politeness. "I'll arrange your return passage." And just like that, he turned and walked away, leaving her abandoned on a splintered platform in the middle of nowhere. Her dreams of a new life didn't just crumble, they were stomped into the ground. Humiliation cut deeper than any prairie wind. She was alone, penniless, and thousands of miles from anything she'd ever known. But what she didn't know, what Wade Harlan didn't know, was that someone else was watching. From the shadows of the nearby cattle pens, a man stood apart from the others. He was a giant, built like an oak tree, with shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of the world, and his eyes, the color of a pale winter sky, saw everything. He saw the cold rejection. He saw Lahi's quiet dignity as she stood there, refusing to break. His name was Boone Ellis, and when he saw her, something ancient and protective stirred in his weathered soul. The story wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. Lahi had spent her last savings on the 3-week journey to Wyoming. Now her only option was a hard bench at the depot, her carpet bag for a pillow. All night she listened to the lonely whistles of trains heading to places she would never see, each one a mournful cry that echoed the emptiness inside her. Inside her bag was everything she held sacred, her mother's silver thimble, needles sharp enough to pierce silk, and a small leather pouch filled with her grandmother's pearl buttons. These were the tools of her trade, the things that had defined her, that had kept her fed in London until the factories came and made women like her obsolete. She had been somebody once. Lahi Jun's fine alterations were famous in her little corner of the world. Then ready-made clothing flooded the market, and her customers vanished like ghosts. The matrimonial agency's letter had arrived on the same day as her final eviction notice. A cruel twist of fate, or so she thought. The sun climbed higher, baking the dusty town. Cheyenne in 1885 was all sharp edges and ambition. Cowboys and merchants moved with a purpose that made her feel like a piece of forgotten luggage. Seeking shade, she watched the cattle pens, where the giant of a man worked. He moved with a strange grace among the massive animals, his voice low and soothing. He wasn't just handling them, he was respecting them. There was a reverence in his movements that held her captive. When he paused to wipe sweat from his brow, his eyes met hers across the dusty expanse. He didn't look away. He just touched the brim of his battered hat, a simple, polite acknowledgement. And then, as the afternoon shadows grew long, he finished his work. But instead of heading to the saloon with the other cowboys, he walked straight toward the depot. He walked straight toward her. "Ma'am," he said, his voice deep and rough, like gravel in a riverbed. "I couldn't help but notice you've been waiting here since yesterday. Is everything all right?" The genuine concern in his voice almost shattered her composure. "I'm quite well, thank you," she lied, her chin held high. "Just waiting for the eastbound train." His pale blue eyes studied her, and she felt as if he could see straight through the lie, right into the broken pieces of her heart. "Begging your pardon, ma'am," he said softly, "but you look like someone who's had a run of bad luck. I'm Boone Ellis." A bitter laugh escaped her lips. "Lahi Jun, formerly of London, England, and more recently, a mail-order bride who didn't quite meet specifications. Understanding flickered in his eyes. Wade Harlan? She nodded, surprised he knew. Figured as much, he said, his jaw tightening. Saw you talking to him. Saw how it ended, too. Wade's got particular ideas about what makes a good wife. Ideas that don't account for what really matters. And what really matters, Mr. Ellis? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Character, he said without a moment's hesitation. Kindness. The strength to weather life's storms without losing your goodness. Size has nothing to do with any of that. No one had spoken to her with such respect in years, but her reality was harsh. That's kind of you to say, but Mr. Harlan's opinion is the one that counted. I'll be returning to New York tomorrow. To what? He asked. And the simple question caught her off guard. What are you returning to? Family? Work? A home? The truth was a raw, gaping wound. She had nothing. No one. Just a vague, fading hope that she might find a way to start over. Somewhere, somehow. He seemed to sense it. I've got a proposition for you, Miss Jun. He paused, his gaze steady. There's an old line shack about 3 miles north of here, right on Antelope Creek. It's not much. 1 room, a stone fireplace, a good roof, but it's sound and dry. You're welcome to stay there while you figure out your next move. She was stunned. I couldn't possibly accept such generosity from a stranger. Why not? He asked simply. Seems to me you could use a safe place to rest and think, and I could use the peace of mind knowing you're not sleeping on a train station bench. But what would people think? She stammered. A woman, alone. His smile was gentle, but his eyes were serious. People will think what they want to think, Miss Jun. The only question is, what do you think? Do you trust me not to harm you? She searched his weathered face, looking for any hint of deception. All she found was a profound sincerity that took her breath away. This giant of a man could have been terrifying. Instead, he was offering her the one thing she needed more than food or money. He was offering her a chance. Yes, she said quietly, her voice trembling slightly. I believe I do trust you, Mr. Ellis. But as he helped her with her bag and led her toward a waiting wagon, a small, cold voice of doubt whispered in the back of her mind. In a land this harsh, was anyone really this kind? Or was she just trading one kind of cage for another? The line shack sat by Antelope Creek like a forgotten prayer. The weathered logs had turned silver gray in the fading light. After a night on a depot bench, the single room with its small windows and the stone chimney looked like a palace. Built this place myself back in '78, Boone said, the old lock groaning as he turned the key. Needed shelter for the line riders watching the herds. Spent 3 weeks getting every log just right. Inside, dust motes danced in the last rays of sunlight. It was sparse, a rough wooden table, a simple bed frame. But it was solid, it was safe. It's perfect, Lahi breathed, and she meant it. Boone seemed surprised by her gratitude. It's been empty for 3 years. Needs a good cleaning. I'll ride to town tomorrow. Get you some provisions, fresh bedding. She turned to face him, the question she'd been holding back finally spilling out. Mr. Ellis, why are you doing this? You don't know me. You owe me nothing. He took off his hat, running a hand through his silver hair. For a fleeting moment, she saw a loneliness in his expression so deep it mirrored her own. I know what it's like to be alone in the world, he said, his voice low. To have nowhere to turn. No one who cares if you live or die. I wouldn't wish that feeling on anyone. But surely you have family, friends? No, ma'am, he said, his gaze distant. Lost my folks to fever when I was 16. Been on my own ever since. This place has been empty too long. Seems right that someone should make use of it. That night, as firelight cast dancing shadows across the small cabin, Lahi felt something she hadn't experienced in years, a sense of belonging. The cabin wasn't hers, but it offered her sanctuary, and as she drifted to sleep, she realized she hadn't just been given a roof over her head. She'd been given a flicker of hope. The next few days passed in a peaceful routine. Boone brought supplies, flour, coffee, salted bacon, and Lahi, in return, insisted on mending his worn work clothes, her nimble fingers flying with practiced ease. They would talk for hours, sharing stories of their past like old friends. She learned he worked for one of the big cattle operations, riding the lines to check fences and watch over the herds. He learned about her life in London, about the craft she loved, and the changing world that had cast her out. She found herself admiring the quiet strength in him, the gentleness that seemed so at odds with his imposing frame. She started to feel safe. She started to feel happy. But paradise never lasts long, especially when you're living in a place built on secrets. One afternoon, while cleaning out the dusty corners of the cabin, her broom knocked against a loose floorboard beneath the bed. Curiosity got the better of her. She pried it up. Underneath, nestled in the dark, cool earth, was a small, locked metal box. It was heavy, old, and clearly hidden for a reason. When Boone returned that evening, she didn't mention it. She watched him, trying to reconcile the kind man who brought her wildflowers with the man who kept a locked box hidden under his floor. What secrets did he have? Was his kindness just a mask? The next day, her quiet sanctuary was invaded. "We had visitors today," Boone said, a new tension in his shoulders as he dismounted his horse. "Visitors?" "Mrs. Bertie May, from the Church Ladies' Auxiliary," he said, his voice tight. "Word's gotten around about your situation." Lahi's stomach clenched. "What did she say?" "Nothing pleasant," he spat. "Some folks in town think it's improper. An unmarried woman living out here, accepting help from an unmarried man. They're concerned about appearances." "And what do you think about appearances?" Lahi asked quietly. His pale eyes flashed with a sudden, fierce anger she'd never seen before. "I think Mrs. Bertie May and her friends would rather see you sleeping in the street than risk a whisper of scandal. They're more concerned with gossip than they are with Christian charity." "But their concerns aren't entirely without merit," Lahi argued, her own sense of propriety warring with her gratitude. "I am a woman alone. Proper society would have left you stranded at that depot," Boone interrupted, his voice booming in the small clearing. "Would have let you starve rather than risk a raised eyebrow." The vehemence in his voice stunned her. "You're angry." "Damn right I'm angry," he said, pacing back and forth. "These same women, so concerned about propriety. Where were they when Wade Harlan cast you aside? Where was their charity when you were sleeping on a cold bench with nowhere to go?" His anger was for her, a defense of her honor that was both terrifying and thrilling. But later that night, after he'd left, her mind went back to the hidden box. His fierce protectiveness felt real, but so did the secret he was keeping. Driven by a need to understand the man who had saved her, she found one of her sturdiest needles. She knelt by the loose floorboard, her heart pounding in her chest. For a long moment, she hesitated. Then, taking a deep breath, she began to pick the lock. She had to know what was inside. She had to know if Boone Ellis was a savior or a very, very clever monster. The lock was old and stubborn, but Lahi's fingers were patient. With a final, satisfying click, it sprang open. Her hands trembled as she lifted the heavy lid. She didn't know what she expected to find. Money, maybe a weapon, something that explained his solitary life. What she found stopped her breath in her throat. The box was lined with faded silk. On top lay a stack of letters, tied with a black ribbon. Beneath them, carefully folded, was a woman's dress made of fine wool in a small leather-bound journal. Her heart pounded as she opened the journal. The handwriting was elegant, feminine. It spoke of hopes and dreams, of a new life in Wyoming. It spoke of love for a brother named Boone. And then the entries turned dark. They described a man, a charismatic, handsome man who promised her the world. A man who wooed her, then slowly, cruelly, took control of her finances, her land, her very spirit. The final entry was a scrawl of terror and despair, a plea for help. The journal ended there, abruptly. This wasn't just a box of mementos. It was a tomb. It was the story of Boone's sister. Shaking, Lahi dug deeper. At the very bottom of the box, wrapped in oilcloth, were legal documents, land deeds, not for a small homestead, but for 2,000 acres of prime Wyoming territory. And the name on every single one was Boone Ellis. Understanding dawned like a cold, terrifying sunrise. He wasn't a simple ranch hand. He was the rancher. He wasn't just some drifting cowboy with a good heart. He was wealthy, powerful. He was one of the biggest landowners in the territory, and he had lied to her. Every single day he had let her believe he was a poor solitary man, just like her. The entire foundation of their fragile trust shattered. The kindness, the shared meals, the easy conversation. Had it all been a game? A deception? She felt a wave of nausea. Was he toying with her? Was this some rich man's cruel amusement, pretending to be poor to see how the desperate little seamstress would react? The humiliation she felt on the train platform was nothing compared to this. This felt like a betrayal of the soul. She was still on her knees, the deeds clutched in her hand, when the cabin door creaked open. Boone stood there, his shadow falling over her. He took in the scene in an instant. The open box, the journal in her lap, the deeds in her hand. His face, usually so gentle, went pale. All the warmth drained from his eyes, replaced by a look of raw, hunted pain. "Lahi," he whispered, his voice cracking. 2,000 acres, she said, her own voice shaking with a mixture of anger and hurt. She held up the deeds. "You lied to me. You let me mend your clothes and share your simple meals, all while you owned half the valley. Why? Was I some kind of charity case? An amusement?" He sat down heavily on the chair across from her, looking suddenly older than his years. "No," he said quietly. "Never. Lahi, I've learned that people see wealth before they see the man. When they find out what I have, they change. They want something from me. I wanted you to know me. The real me. The real you." Her voice rose sharp with disbelief. "Which part was real, Boone? The humble cowboy who felt sorry for me? Or the wealthy rancher who was hiding his entire life?" "Both," he insisted, his voice pleading. "The money. It's just something I have. It came from years of hard work, smart investments, and a few lucky breaks. But it didn't change who I am inside. I'm still the boy who lost his parents. I'm still the brother who lost his sister." He gestured to the journal. "I'm still the man who saw a good woman being treated cruelly and wanted to help." His sister, the journal. The story wasn't just about his wealth, it was about his pain. "You let me think," she started, but he cut her off. "I let you think I was someone worth knowing for reasons that had nothing to do with what I own," he said, his eyes locking with hers. "And wasn't I right? Haven't these last few weeks, haven't they meant something to you?" The question hung in the air between them, a challenge and a plea. And the terrible, confusing truth was that they had meant something, more than she had been prepared for, more than she wanted to admit, even to herself. "I don't know what to believe anymore," she whispered, her anger dissolving into a sea of confusion. "Believe this," he said, leaning forward, his voice intense. "Every moment we've spent together, every conversation, every shared meal, that was real. The only thing I hid from you was the size of my bank account and the depth of my scars." Before she could process his words, the sound of hoofbeats thundered outside, stopping abruptly. A sharp, authoritative knock rattled the cabin door. Boone's body went rigid. He opened the door to reveal a man with a silver star pinned to his vest. The territorial judge, Emery Jack. And he wasn't alone. Standing just behind him, a smug, vindictive look on his face, was Wade Harlan. "Boone Ellis," the judge said, his voice cold and official. "There's been a serious accusation leveled against you. I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to come with me." "An accusation?" Boone said, stepping protectively in front of Lahi. "What kind of accusation?" Judge Jack's eyes flickered from Boone to Lahi, then back again. "Mr. Harlan here," he said, gesturing to the smirking rancher, "claims you've been holding Miss June against her will, that you lured her out to this isolated cabin with ill intent. He's concerned for her safety." Lahi's mind reeled. This wasn't about gossip or appearances anymore. This was a formal charge. Wade Harlan, the man who had discarded her like trash, was now pretending to be her savior. It was a lie, a vicious, calculated lie. "That's absurd," Boone growled. "She's here as my guest." "Is she?" the judge asked, his gaze settling on Lahi. "Miss Jun, are you here of your own free will? Are you safe? Every instinct screamed at her to defend Boone, to expose Wade's hypocrisy. But her world had been turned upside down. The man standing beside her was a stranger in so many ways. He had lied to her, hidden his life from her. Could she, in this moment, stand before the law and vouch for a man she wasn't even sure she knew? Her hesitation was all Wade needed. You see, Judge, Wade said, his voice dripping with false concern. She's terrified. This man is a known recluse, a brute. Who knows what he's capable of? He probably saw a vulnerable woman and decided to take what he wanted. The lie was so grotesque, so twisted, that it snapped Lahi out of her confusion. She looked at Wade's smug face, and then at Boone's, which was a mask of controlled fury and hurt. She remembered the gentleness in Boone's hands, the kindness in his eyes, the shared laughter over a simple meal. And she remembered the cold, dismissive cruelty in Wade's. The lie might have been about Boone, but the insult was aimed at her. It painted her as a weak, foolish victim, incapable of making her own choices. That is not true, Lahi said, her voice small but clear as a bell. The men all turned to look at her. She took a step forward, her chin rising. Mr. Harlan is lying. I am here because Mr. Ellis offered me shelter when this man, she pointed a trembling finger at Wade, left me stranded and penniless. Mr. Ellis has shown me nothing but kindness and respect. A flicker of relief crossed Boone's face. Wade's smirk faltered. A likely story, Wade sneered. He's probably threatened her into saying that. The truth is, Miss Junn, Judge Jack said, his tone softening slightly, your situation is irregular. A woman of your standing cannot simply live alone in a cabin on a man's property. Whether Mr. Ellis is a gentleman or not, the law and society have rules. Mrs. Bertie May and her auxiliary have filed a formal complaint. They are demanding that you be removed for your own protection and to prevent a moral scandal. He sighed, looking weary. They're suggesting vagrancy charges, moral turpitude. If you have no family, no means of support, they could send you to a workhouse. The threat hung in the air, cold and terrifying. A workhouse. It was a prison sentence for being poor and alone. After the judge and a scowling Wade Harlan left, with a warning that they would return in 2 days to see the situation regularized, a heavy silence fell over the cabin. Lahi walked down to the creek, her mind a whirlwind. She had just defended a man who had lied to her against the man who had rejected her in front of a judge who threatened to imprison her. She'd escaped the poverty of London only to find a new kind of trap in the vast open spaces of Wyoming. The water murmured over the stones, indifferent to her turmoil. She had been living a lie, a comfortable illusion of simplicity. But had the feelings been a lie? Had the connection she felt with Boone been based only on deception? She remembered the way he talked about his sister, the raw pain in his voice. That hadn't been a lie. The way he looked at her sometimes, as if she were the first bit of sunlight after a long winter. That hadn't felt like a lie either. When she returned to the cabin, she found Boone waiting on the small porch. He was holding something small, wrapped in a piece of cloth. Before you say anything, he said, his voice heavy with emotion, I need you to know something. I'm not trying to buy your forgiveness. I'm trying to show you the truth. He unwrapped the cloth. Resting in his large calloused palm was a simple gold ring, worn smooth with age. This was my mother's wedding ring, he said softly. It's the only thing of hers I have left. I've carried it for 40 years. I never thought I'd have a reason to offer it to anyone. He took a shaky breath, then slowly, deliberately, he knelt before her on the porch steps. The giant of a man, the wealthy rancher, was on his knees before the penniless seamstress. Lahi Junn, he said, his pale eyes shimmering with unshed tears. I am not asking you to marry me because of the gossips, or the judge, or Wade Harlan. I'm asking because in these past few weeks, you have become the home I never thought I'd have. The money, the land, it's just dirt and paper, Lahi. But you're everything I didn't know I was looking for. Will you marry me? Tears blurred her vision, spilling down her cheeks. A proposal, a way out. But was it a solution born of desperation, or a declaration born of love? How do I know? she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. How do I know what's real anymore? Let me show you, he said, standing and extending his hand to her. Come with me. He led her away from the cabin, up a gentle rise to a ridge that overlooked the entire valley. The setting sun painted the landscape in shades of gold and crimson. And there, nestled in a grove of cottonwood trees, was the unmistakable frame of a house. It was new, the raw wood glowing in the golden light. The foundation was laid, the walls half built. I started building this the day after you agreed to stay in the shack, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Not because I expected anything, but because I hoped. I hoped that you might find a reason to make Wyoming your home. I wasn't just offering you a temporary cabin, Lahi. He turned to face her, his expression more open and vulnerable than she had ever seen it. I was building us a future, if you'll have it. Lahi looked from the frame of the new house, a silent testament to his hope, to the simple gold ring still resting in his palm, and then into his eyes. And in their pale blue depths, she finally saw the whole truth. She saw the lonely boy, the grieving brother, and the powerful man, all wrapped into one. And she saw the love he was offering her, a love as solid and real as the mountains on the horizon. The wedding was simple, held just 2 days later under a hastily constructed pine bough arch, with Judge Jack officiating. His stern demeanor had been replaced by a quiet respect. A handful of Boone's ranch hands stood as witnesses, men who had come to admire the quiet woman who had captured their boss's heart. Lahi wore a blue dress that Boone had bought her, which she had altered to fit her perfectly. He wore his best shirt, the one she had so carefully mended just weeks before. There was no grand reception, no fancy feast. Instead, they shared their first coffee as husband and wife from the same battered tin cup they had used in the line shack. As they sat on the porch of the cabin, now truly theirs, Boone's weathered hand found hers. Any regrets? He asked softly. Only that it took me 56 years to find you, she replied, her heart full. The town's reaction was a mix of shock and grudging acceptance. Mrs. Birdie Mae was left speechless, her campaign of moral outrage collapsing into confused whispers. Wade Harlan disappeared from Cheyenne, his venomous lies having failed him. Some people still gossiped, but the talk faded when they saw how Boone adored his new bride, and how Lahi, in turn, blossomed under the steady warmth of his love. She wasn't just a rancher's wife. She started a business from her cabin, her reputation as a skilled seamstress spreading like wildfire through the territory. Women would ride for miles to have a dress made by Mrs. Ellis, the woman whose stitches were as strong and true as her character. The woman who had been deemed too small and not sturdy enough became one of the most respected and successful businesswomen in the region. Their life together found a beautiful, quiet rhythm. They worked side by side, building the ranch and the new house. Their love wasn't built on grand pronouncements, but on the small daily acts of devotion, shared meals, quiet conversations by the fire, the simple, profound pleasure of companionship after a lifetime of solitude. But the past, as Lahi was about to discover, rarely stays buried forever. And Wade Harlan wasn't the kind of man to accept defeat. One evening, about 6 months after their wedding, a young, frantic ranch hand rode up to the cabin. "Mr. Ellis, there's a fire down by the south pasture, moving fast toward the old creek bed." The old creek bed, near the original line shack. Boone's face went grim. "That's no wildfire. The wind's blowing the wrong way." It was arson. Boone and his men rode off to fight the blaze, leaving Lahi to watch the terrifying orange glow on the horizon. A sense of dread coiled in her stomach. This was more than just a fire. It was a message. As the hours passed, her anxiety grew. She paced the cabin, her mind racing. Wade Harlan. It had to be him. He had been humiliated, and a man like that couldn't let it go. He wanted revenge. He wanted to destroy everything Boone had built, everything they had built together. Suddenly she heard a sound outside, not the thunder of returning horses, but the quiet crunch of a boot on gravel. Her heart leaped into her throat. She peered through the window and saw a figure silhouetted against the distant fire. It was Wade Harlan, and he was holding a torch. "You should have taken the train back east, little bird," he snarled, his face twisted with rage and madness. You cost me everything. Now I'm going to take everything from him, starting with you." He lunged for the cabin door. Lahi screamed, scrambling backwards, her mind frantically searching for a weapon, for an escape. But there was nowhere to run. The cabin was a tinderbox, and he was standing in the only exit. Then her eyes fell on her sewing basket. It was overflowing with the tools of her trade, spools of heavy thread, a pair of sharp steel scissors, and a velvet cushion bristling with needles of every size, long, wicked-looking upholstery needles among them. The things that had once defined her weakness, her smallness, her delicate work, were about to become her only hope for survival. Wade kicked the door open, the torch held high, a crazed look in his eyes. He was bigger, stronger, and filled with hate. But Lahi June Ellis had something he didn't. She had a will of iron, forged in a lifetime of quiet resilience, and she was done being called small. As Wade Harlan stepped into the cabin, a triumphant sneer on his face, Lahi moved faster than she ever had in her life. She didn't run away. She ran towards her sewing basket. "Nowhere to hide," he taunted, taking another step inside. "I'm not hiding," she said, her voice steady despite the terror pounding in her chest. In one fluid motion, she grabbed 2 large spools of thick, waxed linen thread. As he lunged for her, she dropped to the floor and rolled, letting out the thread as she went. It stretched taut between the legs of the heavy wooden table and the door frame, about ankle high. It was a simple trick, but in the flickering, uncertain light of his torch, it was nearly invisible. Harlan, his eyes fixed on her, didn't see the trap. He took one more step and his boot caught the thread. He went down hard, his head cracking against the floorboards with a sickening thud. The torch flew from his hand, landing dangerously close to a pile of curtains. He was stunned, but not unconscious. He pushed himself up, shaking his head to clear it, a low growl of fury rumbling in his chest. Lahi knew she only had seconds. She scrambled back to her sewing basket. Her hand closed around the familiar weight of her tailor's shears. Heavy, cold steel, the blades 8 inches long and lethally sharp. As he got to his knees, she brandished them in front of her. "Get out!" she commanded, her voice ringing with an authority that surprised even herself. He laughed, a ragged, ugly sound. "You think you can stop me with a pair of scissors, you pathetic little mouse?" He rose to his feet, swaying slightly. He was done playing games. He lunged again, but this time she was ready. She didn't aim for his body. She aimed for his weapon. With a snip of the shears that was as precise as any cut she'd ever made in silk, she severed the thick leather strap of the satchel he wore. The one she now saw was filled with oil-soaked rags. It fell to the floor, spilling its flammable contents. He stared at the broken strap in disbelief, his momentum broken. That moment of surprise was all she needed. Her other hand had found the velvet cushion. She snatched the longest, thickest needle, an upholstery needle, 4 inches long and sharp as a fang. As he reached for her, she drove it with all her might into the fleshy part of his outstretched arm. He roared in pain and shock, stumbling back, clutching his arm. He looked down at the needle buried deep in his muscle, then back at her, his eyes wide with a new kind of fear. He had seen her as a fragile doll, a helpless victim. He was now seeing a woman who would not be broken, a survivor who used the tools of her quiet life to wage a brutal, effective war. The fire from the dropped torch was catching on the curtains now, smoke beginning to fill the small cabin. They were running out of time. Harlan, clutching his arm, made a final, desperate move. He kicked over the oil lamp on the table, sending a river of fire across the floor, blocking her path to the door. "If I can't have my revenge," he screamed, his voice cracking with madness, "then we'll all burn together." The cabin was turning into an inferno. Smoke stung her eyes and heat blistered her skin. She was trapped. Just then, the sound of galloping horses grew from a distant thunder to a ground-shaking roar. The cabin door, already damaged by Harlan's entry, was kicked clean off its hinges. Boone stood there silhouetted against the flames, his face a mask of primal fury. He took in the scene in a heartbeat. Harlan, crazed and injured, the spreading fire, and Lahi, cornered but defiant, her scissors still gripped in her hand. He didn't hesitate. He launched himself at Harlan, and the 2 men crashed to the floor. While his men rushed in with water buckets, battling the flames, Boone subdued the weakened Harlan. He dragged him outside and threw him to the ground as Judge Jack, who had ridden out with the party, placed him under arrest. Boone rushed back into the smoky cabin. He found Lahi coughing, her face smudged with soot, but unharmed. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her tight against his chest. "I thought I'd lost you," he breathed into her hair. She pulled back, looking up at him, her eyes clear and fierce. "This is a sturdy woman," she said, her voice raspy from the smoke. "One who can handle ranch work and anything else that comes her way." A slow smile spread across Boone's face, a smile of pure awe and adoration. He looked at the chaos around them, the smoldering curtains, the broken door, the defeated villain being dragged away. And then he looked at his wife, this incredible woman who had faced down a monster with a needle and thread. The woman who was told she was too small had just proven she was the strongest person he had ever known. Justice in the Wyoming Territory was swift. Wade Harlan, his crimes of arson and attempted murder laid bare for all to see, was sentenced to hang. The community that had once whispered about Lahi now sang her praises. She was a hero. Her story became a local legend, a testament to the fact that courage isn't measured in pounds or inches. The half-built house on the ridge was completed, and it became a home filled with light, laughter, and a love that had been tested by fire and betrayal. The old line shack was repaired and preserved, a cherished monument to where their story began. And the battered tin cup still sat on their kitchen table, a daily reminder that the most precious things in life are often the simplest. Lahi June Ellis, the woman who had arrived in Cheyenne with nothing but a broken promise, had found everything. She had found a home, a purpose, and a love as vast and enduring as the Wyoming sky. She had learned that our greatest failures are sometimes just detours, leading us toward our greatest happiness, and that the true measure of a person is found not in their size, but in the indomitable strength of their heart. Their love story still echoes on the Wyoming winds, a testament to kindness, courage, and the beautiful truth that sometimes the most magnificent new beginnings rise from the ashes of our most painful endings. If you were moved by Lahi's story and believe that true strength comes from within, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button, because what you see on the surface is almost never the whole story. And I've got another one coming tomorrow that will prove it.